a rusted jukebox, a sealed envelope, and a man who had spent 16 years making sure neither one would ever be found. When Liam Carter knelt down in front of that old machine, hands still smudged with grease, he wasn't thinking about secrets. He was thinking about whether he could afford next month's rent and whether his son had eaten breakfast. He had no idea that the thing sitting in the corner of Victoria Sterling's mansion, silent, forgotten, draped in a cloth like something shameful, was about to tear open a wound that powerful people had bled a fortune to keep closed. If you want to know what was inside that envelope, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The drive from East Nashville to the Sterling estate took 40 minutes on a good day. This was not a good day. Liam Carter sat behind the wheel of his 2009 pickup truck, a vehicle that technically ran but had a check engine light that had been glowing steadily since March. Inching through downtown traffic with one hand on the wheel and the other pressed flat against the dashboard like he could manually will the air conditioning back to life. It was the third week of June, 91 degrees outside. The window was cracked open just enough to let in a ribbon of hot air and the sound of someone's bass-heavy music bleeding out of the car ahead of him. On the passenger seat, held down by a cracked phone case, was a handwritten work order. Sterling Residence, 441, 2 Belmont Crest Drive. 1 Vintage Jukebox, Model Wurlitzer 2000, approximate year 1962. Unit non-operational. Client requests full restoration if feasible. Contact Ms. Victoria Sterling. He'd gotten the call 3 days ago from Marcus Webb, the guy who ran the front desk at the workshop and also, somewhat chaotically, served as Liam's unofficial booking manager. Marcus had a habit of accepting jobs before confirming them with Liam, which was either entrepreneurial spirit or a personality flaw, depending on the day. "It's a Sterling," Marcus had said, as though that settled everything. "I know what a Wurlitzer is, Marcus. Not the machine, the family. Victoria Sterling. You know, Sterling Sound, the label." Liam had heard of Sterling Sound the way you hear of weather patterns, something that existed in the background of the city, shaping things without you thinking too much about it. Nashville had 3 kinds of royalty: old country money, new country money, and the quiet industry money that sat behind both. The Sterlings were the third kind. "How long has it been down?" Liam asked. 16 years, she said. He'd whistled low. 16 years was a long time. Long enough for internal mechanisms to seize, for rubber components to crack and crumble, for wiring to corrode into something approaching modern art. A machine that old, sitting that long, there was a real possibility it was unsalvageable. But that kind of job also paid well. And Liam needed the money. So here he was. He pulled off the interstate and wound through a series of increasingly wide residential streets until the houses stopped being houses and started being statements. Gated driveways, manicured hedges, the kind of landscaping that required a professional to maintain. He found 4412 and rolled to a stop in front of an iron gate flanked by 2 brick columns, each one taller than his truck. He pressed the intercom. A woman's voice crackled through. "Yes?" "Liam Carter, Carter Restoration. I have a 9 o'clock. A pause. Then the gate swung open. The house was something. He'd worked in some impressive places over the years, old plantation homes converted into event venues, a restored Victorian in Germantown, once a penthouse in a downtown high-rise, where some producer had wanted a 1950s diner jukebox installed in his living room as a conversation piece. But the Sterling estate was different. It wasn't trying to impress you. That was the thing about real money. It didn't have to try. The main house was a wide colonial revival with white columns and dark shutters, set back from the circular driveway by a broad stretch of lawn. Mature oaks lined the property. There was a fountain in the center of the drive that looked like it hadn't been turned on in a while. A bird had built a nest in the basin. A woman opened the front door before he reached the steps. She was younger than he'd expected. Early 30s, maybe. Dark hair pulled back in a knot that suggested she'd started the day with a plan and then promptly abandoned half of it. She was wearing a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, dark trousers, and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She had a coffee mug in one hand and a phone in the other, and she looked like someone who had been awake for several hours already and was quietly annoyed about it. "Mr. Carter?" she said. "That's me." He reached the top step and extended a hand. "Liam." She shook it. Her grip was firm. "Victoria Sterling, thanks for coming out. I know it's a bit of a haul from East Nashville." "Not bad. Traffic's usually cleared by 9. "Usually?" she said, with a tone that suggested she'd learned not to trust usually in most contexts. "Come on in. Coffee?" "I'm fine, thank you." She held the door open and he stepped inside. The entry hall smelled like old wood and something floral. Not a candle, more like the accumulated scent of cut flowers brought in weekly for decades. The floors were dark hardwood, worn to a soft patina in the high traffic areas. Family portraits lined one wall in a mixture of frames that had accumulated across generations, oils and photographs, and one charcoal sketch of a woman whose strong jaw and direct gaze suggested she had never been particularly interested in anyone's opinion of her. Victoria led him through the hall and into a large sitting room that opened into what she called, without irony, the music room. It was exactly that. One wall was shelving, floor to ceiling, filled with vinyl records in paper sleeves, organized, from what Liam could tell at a glance, by decade. There was a baby grand piano in one corner with sheet music still propped on the stand, framed concert posters, some of them going back to the 50s and 60s, gold records, a reel-to-reel tape machine on a side table. The room had the feel of a place that had once been lived in, heavily, and then carefully preserved. And in the far corner, draped in a cream-colored cloth, stood the jukebox. Even covered, you could see the shape of it, the curved top, the wide body, the faint outline of the speaker grills. It was about 5 feet tall and maybe 3 feet wide. A Wurlitzer, the Cadillac of jukeboxes, in Liam's professional estimation. "There she is," Victoria said quietly, and something shifted in her voice that hadn't been there before. Something personal. 2 other people were already in the room. One was a heavy-set man in his early 50s, standing near the window with his arms crossed. He had the look of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any given room, and the mild dissatisfaction of a man who had just been reminded that wasn't always the case. The other was a younger woman, late 20s, dark-skinned and sharp-eyed, sitting on the piano bench with a notepad in her lap. She smiled when Liam came in. "This is Diane," Victoria said, gesturing to the woman with the notepad. "She handles operations for the company, and this is Arthur Langford. He's been our family's attorney for 28 years, Arthur said. He didn't move from the window. "Mr. Carter." "Mr. Langford." Something in the man's posture read as performative. Not hostile exactly, more like a man who had rehearsed, relaxed, and not quite nailed it. Liam turned back to the jukebox. "Can I take a look?" "Please," Victoria said. He walked over and lifted the cloth off carefully, folding it to one side. The Wurlitzer 2000 was, or had been, at some point, a beautiful machine. Mahogany cabinet, chrome trim, the characteristic curved top and arched front that made the model recognizable to anyone who knew vintage jukeboxes. The coin mechanism was original, the selection button still present, the title strips still visible in their little plastic windows, though faded now, the ink having surrendered to time and neglect. The front glass was intact, which was a minor miracle. Most jukeboxes this age had replaced glass at least once. He crouched down, clicked open his work case, and pulled out a pen light. "When was the last time it ran?" he asked. 1991, Victoria said. "My grandmother died that year. She was the one who—" It was hers. She kept it in this exact spot for 30 years. Liam moved the light across the lower grill, checking the speaker cloth. "Do you know why it stopped working?" "Nobody knows. It just stopped. One day it played, next day it didn't. My mother always meant to have it looked at, but she never got around to it. And then after she passed—" Victoria paused. "The house came to me and the jukebox just stayed there." "No one tried to repair it in 16 years? "My mother wasn't sentimental about it. Honestly, I don't think she liked it very much." Victoria seemed to catch herself. "That's a strange thing to say about a jukebox." "People project," Liam said, without looking up. "It's not strange." He worked his way around the machine methodically, checking the exterior for obvious damage, testing the hinges, examining the coin slot. The chrome was tarnished but present. The wood had surface scratches but hadn't warped. Structurally, the cabinet was sound. "The machine itself is in better shape than I expected," he said, sitting back on his heels. 16 years in a climate-controlled house helps. I won't know about the internal mechanisms until I open her up, but from the outside, this is restorable. He heard Victoria exhale. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "Depends on parts. Some of this I can source quickly. Other things, the motor, certain rubber components, might take a few weeks. Realistically, you're looking at 4 to 6 weeks for a full restoration, possibly less if the internal damage is minimal." "And cost?" He gave her a number. It wasn't a small number. She didn't flinch. "Okay. When can you start?" "I can take it back to my workshop today if you have someone to help me load it." "Done." Arthur cleared his throat from his spot near the window. "Victoria, are you sure this is the right time for a project like this? With everything going on with the Hargrove contract, your schedule is—" "Arthur." Her voice was pleasant but had an edge to it, the way a chef's knife is pleasant and has an edge. "I've been looking at that jukebox for 16 years. I'd like to hear it play." Arthur gave a small nod and said nothing else. Diane caught Liam's eye from across the room and gave him a small, conspiratorial smile, as though to say, "This is normal." Loading a 500-pound vintage jukebox into a pickup truck was not a process designed to maintain one's dignity. It took Liam, Diane, and a groundskeeper named Earl about 40 minutes, 2 furniture dollies, a set of moving straps, and one near disaster involving a porch step to get the Wurlitzer secured in the truck bed. Victoria appeared midway through, took one look at the scene, and wordlessly went back inside. She emerged 3 minutes later with a bottle of water for each of them. "You've done this before," Liam noted, accepting the water. "I grew up watching roadies load equipment," she said. "You learn when to stay out of the way." He almost smiled. The drive back was slow and deliberate. He had the jukebox secured with 4 straps and still found himself checking the rearview mirror every 2 minutes. Some things were too old and too irreplaceable to take chances with. His workshop was in a converted garage bay in a small commercial strip on the east side of the city, not impressive from the outside, but functional. He'd rented it for 6 years. The walls were lined with pegboards holding tools organized in a way that looked chaotic to anyone who didn't know the system. There was a workbench that ran the full length of one wall, illuminated by a row of LED shop lights that he'd installed himself. A small radio sat in one corner, usually tuned to a country station that played older stuff. Merle Haggard, Don Williams, Emmylou Harris. His kid had asked him once why he never played anything new. "Because new music doesn't know anything yet," he'd told the boy, which wasn't entirely fair but felt true enough. He got the jukebox unloaded with help from his neighbor, a former mechanic named Gerald, who owed him a favor, and set it up in the center of the workspace under the main lights. Then he went to pick up his son. Noah Carter was 6 years old and deeply serious about a select number of things: dinosaurs, breakfast foods, and the question of whether dogs understood time. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, gray-green, watchful, the kind of eyes that notice things. He was sitting on the front steps of the after-school program when Liam pulled up, backpack between his knees, carefully examining a stick he'd found somewhere. "What's the stick for?" Liam asked, pushing open the passenger door. "Defense," Noah said with total gravity. "Against what?" Noah considered this. "I don't know yet, but it's good to be ready." Liam couldn't argue with that. They stopped at the grocery on the way home, the one with the self-checkout that Noah was obsessed with operating himself, which meant their grocery runs took approximately twice as long as they should have. Liam stood behind him and watched him scan a can of soup 3 times before they figured out the barcode issue, and thought about nothing in particular. Just the sound of the store, the hum of the freezer cases, his son's focused frown. These were the moments he'd learned to pay attention to, the ones that didn't look like anything special but turned out to be. Back at the apartment, Liam made pasta, the simple kind, with butter and Parmesan, because Noah had gone through a phase at age 4 of refusing tomato sauce and never entirely come back from it, while Noah sat at the kitchen table drawing what appeared to be a very large dinosaur battling a very small but confident-looking robot. I got a new job today, Liam said, setting a bowl in front of him. What kind? A jukebox. Noah looked up. What's a jukebox? It's a machine that plays music. This one's from 1962. How old is that? Older than me. Older than your grandpa. Noah absorbed this information. Is it broken? Pretty broken, yeah. Can you fix it? Liam sat down across from him. That's the plan. Noah nodded, seeming satisfied, and went back to his drawing. The robot appeared to be winning. The first week with the jukebox was diagnostic. Liam worked methodically, the way he always did, starting from the outside and working in, documenting each step with photographs and handwritten notes. He'd learned early in his career that restoration work was, at its core, a form of archaeology. You were trying to understand an object's history before you could address its present condition. Every scratch, every repair, every modification told you something about the life the object had lived. The Wurlitzer 2000, as he disassembled it layer by layer, revealed a machine that had been extraordinarily well maintained in its active years. The internal components showed no signs of amateur interference. No one had taken it apart and put it back together wrong, which happened more than you'd think. The original wiring was largely intact. The motor had seized, but from age and lack of lubrication rather than damage. Several rubber drive rollers had hardened and cracked. The amplifier needed new capacitors. None of this was catastrophic. What stopped him on day 3 was the record rack. The Wurlitzer 2000 could hold up to 200 records in its carousel. Victoria's machine had 112. He went through them one by one, cataloging the titles, checking the condition of the vinyl, mostly in remarkable shape, stored in the original paper sleeves. Standards mostly. A few early country and western records. Some big band. Music of a very specific era, curated by someone who knew exactly what she wanted to hear. The last record in the first selection slot was different. Every other record in the machine had a printed label, the standard commercial release labels from Decca or Columbia or RCA Victor. This one had a handwritten label, white, slightly yellowed. The handwriting was neat and careful, a looping cursive that spoke of a generation that had been taught penmanship as a serious subject. It read, "For the one who comes after. E.S. 1961. Liam held it under the light for a long moment. E.S. Eleanor Sterling, he assumed. Victoria's grandmother, the woman who had bought this machine, kept it in her music room for 30 years and left it behind when she died. He set the record carefully aside, in its own sleeve. That afternoon, he called Victoria. "I found something in the machine I want to ask you about," he said. "What kind of something?" "A record. Handwritten label. The initials E.S. and the year 1961. It's in the first selection slot." A pause. When Victoria spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I didn't know there were personal records in there. There might be more. I'm still cataloging, but this one stands out. The label says, 'For the one who comes after.'" Another silence, longer this time. "Don't play it yet," she said finally. "Please, I want to be there when it plays." "Understood. Is it in good condition?" He turned the record over gently. "It's in very good condition. Whoever stored it took care of it." He heard her breathe out. "That sounds like her," Victoria said. "She took care of everything. Week 2. The motor had been sent out to a specialist in Louisville who did nothing but vintage jukebox and pinball machine motors, one of maybe a dozen people in the country with that specific skill set. The replacement rubber rollers had been sourced from a supplier in Ohio. The capacitors for the amplifier were ordered. Everything was in motion. In the meantime, Liam cleaned. The chrome got polished back to something approaching its original luster. The wood cabinet was treated with careful applications of oil soap and then beeswax, the scratches addressed one by one. The front glass, miraculously scratch-free, just needed a clean. He found himself looking at the machine differently than he looked at most restoration jobs. Most jobs were purely mechanical. The object's value was financial or aesthetic, and his relationship to it was professional. Fix it, return it, get paid. There was craft in it, and he took pride in that craft, but there was no mystery. This machine had a mystery. for the one who comes after. A recording made in 1961, hidden in a machine, never meant for public ears. A woman who had kept that secret for 30 years, until death took the keeping of it out of her hands, and now it was sitting in his workshop, waiting. He thought about that sometimes while he worked. The strangeness of being the person who had found it. He wasn't a member of the family. He didn't know Eleanor Sterling and never would. But he'd spent weeks now with her machine, learning how she'd used it, what she'd listened to, how carefully she'd maintained it. He knew things about her life, or at least the edges of it, that her granddaughter didn't. That felt like a responsibility. It was during week 3 that Arthur Langford came by the workshop. Liam hadn't been expecting him. There was no appointment, no call ahead. The man simply appeared in the doorway one afternoon while Liam was working on the amplifier chassis, dressed in a suit that was probably appropriate for a downtown office but looked absurd in a garage workshop. "Mr. Carter." Liam set down his soldering iron. "Mr. Langford, I didn't know you were coming." "I was in the area." He wasn't, obviously. Nobody was just in the area of Liam's workshop. It was on a commercial strip next to a tire shop and a Vietnamese sandwich place, not a destination. "I wanted to check on the progress." "You could have called. Victoria has my number." "I prefer to speak in person about sensitive matters." Liam pulled up a stool and gestured to another one nearby. Arthur looked at the stool for a moment, then sat down, with the careful manner of a man who'd been told to stay off the furniture. "What sensitive matters?" Liam asked. Arthur's eyes moved around the workshop, over the tools, the jukebox, the shelf where Liam had set aside the handwritten record in its separate sleeve. They paused there for just a moment, so brief that you could convince yourself you'd imagined it. "The restoration is coming along?" he asked. "On schedule." "Good, good." He turned the hat he was holding in his hands. He'd actually brought a hat, which struck Liam as odd. "Victoria speaks highly of your work." "That's good to hear." "She's a passionate person," Arthur said. "Sometimes that passion leads her toward sentimentality, toward getting attached to objects, to the idea of what those objects represent. The jukebox, for example, her grandmother's memory." Liam waited. "I want to make sure," Arthur continued carefully, "that whatever you find in that machine, whatever state it's in, whatever's inside it, is handled with appropriate discretion. Victoria has a lot on her plate right now. The company is in a delicate period. The last thing she needs is to be distracted by old things." "Old things," Liam repeated. "Memories, emotions." He paused. "You understand?" "I understand that you're asking me to be careful about what I tell my client." Arthur's expression didn't change. "I'm asking you to exercise professional judgment." Liam looked at him for a moment. Arthur Langford had the face of a man who had spent decades saying reasonable-sounding things while meaning something else entirely. Everything about him, the careful language, the unannounced visit, the eyes that had gone to that separate shelf, suggested a man who was managing something. "I always exercise professional judgment," Liam said, "and part of that is communicating clearly with my client. That's Victoria, not the family attorney." A beat of silence. "Of course," Arthur said, and smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. Just keep it in mind." He stood, put on his hat. "I'll let you get back to work." After he left, Liam sat for a moment on his stool. Then he got up, walked to the shelf, and moved the handwritten record to a locked drawer in his workbench. He didn't tell Victoria about Arthur's visit right away. He turned it over in his head for a few days first, the way he turned over every problem. Quietly, carefully, from multiple angles before committing to a direction. It was possible, he knew, that he was reading too much into it. Arthur was a long-tenured family attorney. He probably had a paternalistic relationship with his clients that he'd never examined critically. The visit could have been exactly what it appeared to be, an overprotective old man worried about his client's emotional state. But the eyes on that shelf, that had been something specific. He called his friend Darnell, who worked in contract law at a firm in Midtown, and asked a general question about family attorneys and the scope of their authority. "Depends on the structure," Darnell said. "If someone's been acting as a general counsel for a family's holdings, trusts, properties, the whole picture, for 20-plus years, they have access to a lot. And in private arrangements especially, there's not always a lot of oversight." What do you mean by oversight? I mean, if you trust someone for 30 years and you don't have an independent accountant looking at things every year, that person has a lot of room to move things around, legally or otherwise. Liam was quiet. Why? Darnell asked. Just a job I'm working on. Darnell knew him well enough not to push. Keep your eyes open, man. He kept his eyes open. Over the following week, he started paying closer attention to the things Victoria mentioned in their occasional check-in calls. The status of a property sale that had apparently taken years longer than expected. A licensing deal that had fallen through under circumstances she found confusing. A charitable endowment her grandmother had supposedly set up that no one could locate the paperwork for. She mentioned these things offhand, the way you mention chronic inconveniences you've learned to live with. Not as red flags, just as the texture of life. To Liam, they sounded like a pattern. He didn't have proof of anything. He wasn't an attorney or an investigator. He was a man who fixed machines for a living and had a talent for noticing when something was wrong with a mechanism. Something was wrong with the mechanism. The motor came back from Louisville on a Thursday. Gerald helped him reinstall it that evening, the two of them working past 9 with the shop doors open to let in the cooler night air. The Vietnamese sandwich place next door had closed, but the smell of bread still drifted over sometimes. Liam worked in near silence, handing tools when Gerald asked for them, listening to the radio. She's going to be beautiful, Gerald said, when the motor was seated and the connections made. She's not running yet. She's going to be beautiful, he repeated with the confidence of a man who has been right about machines before. They called it a night, and Liam drove home. Noah was asleep by the time he got in. The babysitter, a college student named Priya, who lived 2 floors up and seemed to regard Noah as an interesting study subject, had left a note on the kitchen table. He ate 2 pieces of bread and a bowl of cereal, which he insisted was a perfectly normal dinner. I did not fight this battle. Sleeping since 8. Liam stood in the doorway of Noah's room for a minute. The boy was asleep on his stomach, one arm hanging off the side of the bed, mouth slightly open. The nightlight cast everything in a soft amber. On the shelf above his bed, lined up with great seriousness, were 12 plastic dinosaurs in what Noah had once described as fighting order. He thought about Eleanor Sterling and what she'd left behind. A machine. A song. Words written on a record label 60 years ago for a person she hoped would exist. For the one who comes after. He understood that impulse. The final week of restoration was the most satisfying. The machine came together the way good restoration always did. Not perfectly, not like new, but like itself. Better than it had been. Recovered. The motor ran smooth and quiet. The carousel turned. The amplifier with its new capacitors fired up clean. The speaker cloth was replaced with period-appropriate material Liam had sourced from a theatrical supply company in Chicago. He loaded all 112 records back into the rack, minus the handwritten one, which he kept in the locked drawer. He ran a test play on a Frank Sinatra record, In the Wee Small Hours, the first selection. The needle dropped. The music came through clear and full, the warm analog sound of a tube amplifier doing what it was built to do. He sat in the workshop and listened to the whole side. When it finished, he sat for a while longer. Then he called Victoria. "She's ready," he said. Well, they arranged the return for a Saturday afternoon. Victoria had invited, or permitted, Liam wasn't sure which, a small group, Diane, Arthur, 2 other employees of the music company, and a woman named Ruth who had been the Sterling family's housekeeper for 20 years, and who cried quietly when she saw the jukebox coming through the door. "She's exactly the same," Ruth kept saying, touching the cabinet with one hand. "She looks exactly the same." "Better than the same," Diane said warmly. They positioned the Wurlitzer back in its corner of the music room, the exact spot it had occupied for 60 years, judging by the slight indentations in the old hardwood floor. Gerald had built a small wheeled platform for it, so it could be moved without lifting. Liam stood back while they arranged things, watching. Arthur was there in the corner, his usual position, watching with an expression that Liam had spent weeks learning to read. It looked like casual interest. It wasn't. Victoria was wearing a blue dress. Her hair was down. She looked, for the first time since Liam had met her, genuinely nervous. "Before we start it," Liam said when the room had settled, "there's one more thing." He opened his case and retrieved the handwritten record in its sleeve. "This was in the first selection slot. I wanted to return it to you separately, and I wanted you to hear it for the first time with the machine working properly." He handed it to Victoria. She held it in both hands and read the label. For a long moment she didn't say anything. Her face went through something private and complicated. Ruth, across the room, had gone very still. "Is that—" Victoria started. "Your grandmother's handwriting," Ruth said quietly. "Yes, that's her handwriting." Victoria looked at Liam. "You said—" She started again and had to stop. "You said it was a private recording. That's what it appears to be. I didn't play it. I wanted you to be here." She nodded. She was holding the record like it was something fragile, which it was. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady, but only just. "Let's hear it." Liam took the record back, removed it from the sleeve with practiced care, and placed it on the Wurlitzer's turntable. He inserted the key. He pressed the selection. And for the first time in more than 60 years, Eleanor Sterling's voice filled the room. It wasn't a polished production. It had been recorded in what sounded like a small room, maybe a home studio, maybe just a room with good acoustics and a single microphone. You could hear the ambient quiet of the space behind her voice, a piano accompaniment, simple and elegant, and then the voice itself, a contralto with an emotional weight that you didn't expect, a voice that had lived in music for decades and knew exactly how to make every note mean something. Nobody in the room made a sound. Even Arthur was still. The song was about time, about the things you leave behind and the people who come to find them, about the faith, not religious, but human, that if you care enough about something, someone will care enough to come looking. It was 3 minutes and 42 seconds long. When it ended, the needle reached the inner groove and began its gentle, repeating loop. Liam lifted the arm. Silence. Victoria Sterling pressed one hand to her mouth. Ruth was crying openly now, not bothering to hide it. Diane had her arms folded across her chest, her head bent slightly, looking at the floor. Arthur Langford had not moved from his corner. But his face, for the first time since Liam had met him, showed something unguarded. Something that looked almost like fear. Liam noticed. He filed it away. Victoria finally lowered her hand. Her eyes were bright. "She knew," Victoria said, to no one in particular. "She always knew someone would find it." She looked at Liam, and in her expression was something complicated. Gratitude and grief, and the particular feeling of having received something you didn't know you needed. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He didn't say you're welcome because it felt insufficient. He didn't say anything, actually. He just nodded and looked at the machine and let the moment be what it was. What he didn't say, and didn't yet know how to say, was that the song wasn't the only thing he'd found. Inside the jukebox, tucked behind the record rack in a space too deliberate to be accidental, there had been a sealed envelope. He had seen it. He had not touched it. He was going to tell Victoria about it now. "There's one more thing," he said. The envelope was cream-colored heavy stock, the kind of paper that cost something. It had been folded once lengthwise and tucked into a narrow gap behind the record carousel, not hidden carelessly but placed with intention, wedged into a space that was invisible unless you knew to look, unless you had taken the machine completely apart and examined every interior surface with a light. Liam had found it on day 4 of the restoration, when he was cleaning the interior cabinet walls. He'd seen the edge of it and stopped. He'd thought about it for a long time before he did anything at all, which was to photograph it in place, then carefully extract it with 2 fingers, then set it on the workbench and look at it for another 10 minutes. The front of the envelope had a single word written on it, in the same looping cursive as the record label. Victoria. He had put it in the locked drawer with the record and kept it there for 3 weeks, carrying the knowledge of it the way you carry something you know will change things once you set it down. Now he reached into his jacket pocket and held it out. Victoria looked at the envelope for a moment before she took it. Her eyes moved to the handwriting, and something crossed her face, recognition, and then something older than recognition. She turned it over. The flap was sealed with a strip of tape that had yellowed with age but held firm. "When did you find this?" she asked. Week 1, Liam said. I'm sorry I waited. I wanted to make sure the machine was running first. I wanted you to have both things at the same time. She looked at him. He wasn't sure if she was deciding whether to be angry about the 3 weeks. Then she looked back at the envelope, and the question became irrelevant. Can everyone give us a minute? She said. Ruth was already moving toward the door, pulling Diane gently by the arm. The 2 company employees filed out behind them. Arthur didn't move immediately. He was looking at the envelope with an expression that Liam was now cataloging carefully. Not grief, not curiosity. Something more specific, something calculated. Arthur, Victoria said. Of course. He moved. At the door he paused, turned back. Victoria, whatever that contains, remember the context. Your grandmother was an elderly woman at the end of her life. People's perceptions can become... Arthur. Her voice was quiet and absolute. Please, close the door. He did. The room was just the 2 of them now, and the jukebox, and Eleanor Sterling's voice still hanging in the air like something that hadn't quite finished dissolving. Victoria sat down on the piano bench. She held the envelope in her lap with both hands for a long moment. Then she carefully worked the tape loose and opened it. Inside were 2 things: a handwritten letter, 4 pages, and a folded document of some kind. She set the document aside without looking at it and started with the letter. Liam stood near the door, not intruding, not leaving. He wasn't sure what the correct thing was, so he stayed and looked at the window and listened to the sound of a clock somewhere in the house ticking. He heard Victoria's breath change on the 2nd page. Just slightly. Just enough. On the 4th page, she stopped reading. She sat for a moment with the letter open in her hands. Then she picked up the folded document and opened it. It was dense, columns of numbers, what looked like property descriptions, signatures at the bottom. Her eyes moved down it slowly. The way you read something you're hoping will say something different than what you're already understanding it to say. Victoria, Liam said quietly. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, but the muscles around them were doing something that suggested the dryness was an active effort. My grandmother, she said carefully, believed that Arthur had been stealing from the family. For years. She paused. She writes that she didn't have proof. Not the kind that would hold up, but she had suspicions. And she had copies of some documents that she thought told a story if someone knew how to read them. She looked down at the document in her hands. She wrote this letter in the spring of 1991, Victoria said, 6 months before she died. Liam said nothing. She wrote that she put it in the jukebox because she knew Arthur would go through her papers after she died. He'd have legal access. But the jukebox... She almost smiled, but it didn't fully arrive. She wrote that Arthur always hated the jukebox. She says he called it that garish contraption and never came near it. She figured it was the one place in the house he'd never think to look. The clock ticked. She was right, Liam said. She was right. Victoria folded the letter carefully. She writes that she's leaving it for whoever in the family is brave enough to do something about it. She writes... She stopped, composed herself. She writes that she hopes it's me. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Victoria set both documents on the piano bench beside her and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for just a moment, just one moment. Then she dropped them and straightened her back and looked at Liam with an expression that reminded him, suddenly and unexpectedly, of his son staring down at a problem he'd already decided to solve. I need to make some phone calls, she said. Okay. Not to Arthur. No, he agreed. Probably not to Arthur. She stood. She picked up the letter and the document. She looked at the jukebox one more time, at the machine her grandmother had chosen, deliberately, as a hiding place, as a time capsule, as an act of faith in someone she'd never meet. And her expression held something too complicated to name. Then she walked past Liam, opened the door to the music room, and stepped out into the hall. He heard her voice a moment later, calm and clear. Diane, I need you. He stood in the music room alone. He looked at the Wurlitzer in its corner, fully restored, chrome, catching the afternoon light through the tall windows. He thought about Eleanor Sterling recording a song in 1961, 30 years before she died. and putting it in a machine she loved, and writing a letter and sealing it in an envelope and hiding it in the one place a man who hated music would never look. He thought that was either the smartest thing he'd ever heard of or the saddest. Probably both. He picked up his work case, turned off the lamp he'd brought in for the installation, and went to find Ruth to say goodbye. The housekeeper was in the kitchen, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea, still red-eyed. She looked up when he came in. "Is she all right?" Ruth asked. "She's making phone calls," Liam said. "So yeah, I think she's all right." Ruth nodded, seeming to understand that this was, in its way, a good sign. He drove home in the late afternoon heat, the truck cab smelling of old wood and machine oil from weeks of the jukebox's presence, now replaced by whatever this new chapter smelled like. He wasn't sure yet. He passed through downtown and crossed the river and took the long way home without entirely meaning to, winding through neighborhoods he knew by feel more than by address. His phone rang at the first stoplight. Darnell. "You good?" Darnell asked. "Interesting day. You going to tell me about it?" "Not yet." "Okay." A pause. "You safe?" Liam thought about Arthur's eyes on the shelf, the careful language, the hat. "Yeah," he said. "I'm safe." He wasn't entirely sure that was true. The next several weeks moved in a strange rhythm. On the surface, nothing changed. Liam went to work, took other jobs, picked up Noah from school, made dinners that were nutritionally acceptable if not particularly inspired. Noah had entered a phase of asking questions at dinner that had no obvious answer. Why does ice float? Do fish know they're wet? If a color is a kind of light, can blind people feel colors? And Liam answered as honestly as he could, which sometimes meant saying, "I don't know, let's find out," and then spending 20 minutes on his phone while Noah ate his pasta. These evenings were the fixed point of his days. Everything else could be uncertain. These were not. But underneath the surface, things were in motion. Victoria had called Darnell's firm, not Darnell directly, but a senior partner who specialized in financial litigation. She'd also retained a forensic accounting firm out of Atlanta that had handled several high-profile embezzlement cases. Liam knew this not because Victoria told him directly, but because she called him 3 times in the first 2 weeks after the envelope, each time ostensibly to thank him again or to ask some minor question about the jukebox's maintenance, and each time she said something that revealed another layer of what was unfolding. "They found 3 properties," she told him during the second call. "Properties that were supposed to transfer to the family trust after my grandmother died. They didn't. They're held by a shell company that Arthur controls through 2 intermediaries." "How much are they worth?" Liam asked. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Victoria, I know. That's not sloppy bookkeeping." "No," she said. "It's not." During the third call, she was less composed. It was late, after 9, and he could hear the edge of exhaustion in her voice, the fraying that comes not from sadness exactly, but from the sustained effort of holding a difficult truth steady. "My mother knew about the discrepancies," she said. "Some of them, I found emails. She raised it with Arthur twice. He explained them away both times, and she let it go." A pause. She trusted him. He'd been there her whole life. "People do," Liam said. He was sitting on his back porch, the night air finally cool enough to be pleasant. "Trust the wrong person for a long time. It happens." "She let it go," Victoria said again, and the repetition carried the specific grief of someone realizing that their parent had been more fallible than the story they'd told themselves. Liam understood that particular grief. He'd carried a version of it himself, about different things, for years. "It wasn't her fault," he said. "The man spent 28 years building that trust. That's not a mistake on your mother's part. That's a long con." Silence on the line, then, "Why are you—" She stopped. "What? Why are you being this decent about all of it? You're a restoration guy. You fixed a jukebox. You didn't sign up for any of this." He thought about it. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I found the letter. That made me part of it, I guess. I can't unfind it." She laughed, a short, tired, genuine laugh. "Fair enough." After they hung up, he sat on the porch a little longer. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the block. the measured bark of a dog who has found something interesting rather than threatening. Crickets, the low sound of the city at night, which never entirely quieted. He thought about what it meant to find something, to become responsible for it by the simple act of discovery. He thought about Noah, asleep inside. About the morning 5 years ago when a social worker had called him, not because he was next of kin exactly, but because he was the only family left and someone had to take the boy, and would he come? And he had said yes without thinking about it, the way you say yes to anything important before your brain has a chance to complicate it. You found things. You became responsible. That was how it worked. Arthur Langford clearly had a different philosophy. It was a Tuesday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the jukebox's return, when Arthur came to the workshop for the second time. This visit was also unannounced, but the energy was different. Last time he had been careful. The hat, the measured words, the performance of a man casually passing through. This time he parked his car directly in front of the bay door and came in without knocking, which technically you couldn't knock on an open garage bay, but the intent was clear. Liam was at the workbench, working on an unrelated job. A mechanical music box from the 1880s, delicate and fiddly. And he looked up without surprise. He'd been half expecting something. Arthur was in a suit again, but this one was slightly less composed than his usual standard. The knot of his tie was fractionally off-center. He looked like a man who had slept poorly. "Mr. Carter." "Mr. Langford." Liam set down his tools. "Still in the area?" Arthur didn't smile. He walked further into the workshop, hands in his jacket pockets, and looked around with the deliberate patience of a man who had decided he was going to say something and was taking his time getting there. "I'll be direct with you," Arthur said. "I'd appreciate that." He turned to face Liam. "You've been speaking with Victoria regularly since the restoration." It wasn't a question. "She's a client," Liam said. "Clients follow up." "You've been giving her counsel that goes beyond the scope of fixing antique machines." "I've been listening to her talk," Liam said. "There's a difference." Arthur's jaw moved slightly. "There are processes underway right now that could cause serious unnecessary harm to people who have served this family faithfully for decades. If those processes proceed on the basis of misinterpreted documents, of an old woman's confused suspicions, the damage will be irreversible." He delivered this with the practiced authority of a man who had spent his career making complicated things sound reasonable. Liam gave him credit for the performance. It was a good one. "Mr. Langford," Liam said, "I found documents in that jukebox and I returned them to my client. That's what happened. Everything after that is her business, not mine. And yet you keep talking to her." "She keeps calling me." Arthur reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced an envelope. He set it on the workbench between them. It was white, standard business size, and from the look of it, it was not empty. Liam looked at it. He didn't touch it. "I'm not going to insult you by telling you this is for your time or your trouble," Arthur said. "You're a smart man. You know what that is. Tell me anyway." "It's a gesture of appreciation for your discretion, for understanding that your role in this situation was limited to the mechanical restoration and nothing more." He paused. "And for recognizing that the most constructive thing you can do right now is step back." The workshop was quiet. The radio was off. He'd turned it off when he heard the car. Outside, a truck went past on the street. Liam looked at the envelope for another moment. Then he looked at Arthur Langford, at the tie slightly off-center, at the eyes that were careful and tired, and underneath the careful and the tired, something that might have been desperation trying very hard to look like confidence. "No," Liam said. Arthur blinked. "I don't think you've considered—" "I've considered it." He picked up the envelope and held it out. "Take it back." Arthur didn't take it. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at Liam with an expression that was recalibrating, moving through its options. "You have a son," Arthur said. The temperature in the room changed. Liam set the envelope down very carefully on the workbench. He took a breath. He looked at Arthur Langford with an expression that he kept flat and even, because he had learned a long time ago that the moments when you most wanted to lose your composure were exactly the moments when you couldn't afford to. "Say that again," Liam said. His voice was level. Quieter than before, actually. Arthur seemed to realize he had miscalculated. Something shifted behind his eyes. I only meant you have responsibilities, a family, the kind of exposure that comes from being involved in a legal proceeding. Walk out of my shop, Liam said. Mr. Carter, now, please. A long pause. Arthur picked up the envelope from the workbench. He buttoned the single button on his jacket with a mechanical precision that suggested he was doing it to have something to do with his hands. Think about what you're protecting, he said at the door. I am, Liam said. Arthur left. Liam stood at the workbench and looked at the space where the envelope had been. His hands were completely still, which took more effort than it appeared to. After a few minutes, he picked up his phone and called Darnell. I need you to tell me how to report an attempted bribe, he said. A pause on the other end, then, Are you serious? Yeah. All right. Darnell's voice shifted into its professional register. Focused. Precise. Start from the beginning. He started from the beginning. Darnell asked several questions, took notes, and told him not to touch anything Arthur had left, not to delete any messages, not to call Arthur back under any circumstances. He said he'd connect Liam with a contact at the DA's office, and that Liam should write down everything he remembered from the conversation, details, exact words, the timeline of both visits, while it was fresh. Do it tonight, Darnell said. Don't wait. Okay. Liam. A pause. You doing okay? He thought about Noah, about the way Arthur had said you have a son like it was a lever to pull. He thought about the careful deliberateness of a man who had spent 28 years identifying leverage points and using them. I'm fine, he said. You sure? I'm sure. He wasn't entirely, but he would be. He had a talent for getting there. I'm going to go pick up my kid and make dinner, and then I'm going to write everything down, in that order. Good order, Darnell said. He locked the workshop, got in the truck, and drove to the after-school program. Noah was waiting on the front steps as usual, this time with 2 sticks. Apparently he'd promoted his defensive situation since last week. He stood up when he saw the truck and dusted off the back of his pants with the automatic gesture of a 6-year-old who had been told enough times not to sit on dirty surfaces that it had become muscle memory even when he did it anyway. 2 sticks today, Liam said when Noah climbed in. 1 for each hand, Noah said seriously. Right. They drove home. At the grocery they needed milk and bread and Noah's cereal, the expensive kind with the cartoon bird that Noah could argue the nutritional case for with unexpected sophistication. They stood in line at the checkout, and Noah leaned against the cart and looked at the rack of magazines beside the register with the focused blankness of a person whose mind was somewhere else. Dad, Noah said. Yeah. Is everything okay? Liam looked down at him. The gray-green eyes were watching him with that particular quality his son had, the noticing quality, the awareness that something was in the air even if you didn't know the shape of it. Yeah, bud, he said. Everything's okay. Noah considered this, looking at him for another moment with the frank assessment that children had before they learned to make it polite. Okay, Noah said, seeming to arrive at his own conclusion, which apparently aligned with Liam's. They paid for the groceries and went home. That night, after Noah was asleep, Liam sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything from both of Arthur's visits. He wrote it in plain language, chronologically, with as much detail as he could access. The words, the pauses, the envelope, the specific phrasing about his son. He wrote for almost 2 hours. His handwriting was never pretty, but by the end it had gotten smaller and tighter, the way his handwriting always did when he was focused hard on something. When he was done, he read it over once, then folded it and put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept important papers, insurance documents, Noah's school enrollment forms, the lease. Then he called Victoria. She answered on the second ring, which told him she was still awake, which told him the investigation was keeping her up at night. Langford came to my shop today, he said. A pause. What did he want? He tried to buy my silence. Cash in an envelope. Another pause. Longer. Liam. I turned it down. I've already talked to a lawyer and I'm going to report it tomorrow. Okay. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not quite anger. more like someone adding another weight to a scale they'd been watching for a while. Thank you for telling me. He also mentioned Noah. The silence this time was different. It had a quality to it. He mentioned your son, she said. Not a question. The way you repeat something back when you're making sure you heard it right before you decide how to feel about it. Indirectly. He said I had a son, like it was a relevant consideration. That's a threat. It's in the category, he said. I don't think he'd do anything. He's the kind of man who says things to see if they work. But I wanted you to know. She was quiet for a moment. The forensic accountants filed a preliminary report today, she said. The number it's larger than I thought, a lot larger. 3 properties, 2 trust funds that were redirected, a licensing arrangement that paid fees to a company he controls. She paused. 28 years, Liam. He started before my mother even inherited. He let that sit. 28 years was almost his entire life. It was a very long time to look someone in the eye and lie. What happens now? He asked. Now it goes to the DA's office, she said, and to a civil attorney. There are going to be proceedings. It's going to be public eventually, and messy. These things always are. Are you ready for that? She thought about it, which he respected. She didn't say yes reflexively. No, she said finally, but I'm going to do it anyway. He nodded at the kitchen wall, which was not visible to her through the phone, but was the honest response. Your grandmother was counting on that, he said. A long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, not in a fragile way, but in the way of something that has been held together with effort and is briefly, deliberately allowing itself to just be. She wrote in the letter that she was sorry for the weight of it, Victoria said. She wrote that she knew it wasn't fair, leaving it for someone else to carry. But she didn't know what else to do. Another pause. She writes that she hopes whoever finds it will understand that she tried everything she could think of. And then she ran out of time. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Down the hall, behind a closed door, Noah breathed in and out in the steady, uncomplicated rhythm of a sleeping child. She did what she could, Liam said, and then someone else picked it up. Yeah, Victoria said quietly. Someone else picked it up. They said goodnight, and he stayed at the kitchen table a little longer, not thinking about anything particular, just sitting in the quiet of his apartment with the legal pad on the table and the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the city. He thought about machines, about the things that broke inside them, and the patience it took to find out why. About the fact that sometimes you opened something up expecting simple damage and found instead the record of a whole life preserved in the dark, waiting for the right hands. He was tired. He was also, underneath the tired, something else. A feeling that didn't have a clean name, somewhere between purpose and weight. The feeling of being in the middle of something that mattered, which was different from comfortable, but was something. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The report went in on a Wednesday morning. Liam sat in a conference room on the 4th floor of the Davidson County DA's office, a room that smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner, with fluorescent lights that hummed just slightly out of sync with each other, and told the whole story to an assistant district attorney named Patricia Owens, who was somewhere in her mid-40s and had the specific quality of stillness that comes from spending years listening to people tell her things they'd rather not have to say out loud. Darnell was there. He'd insisted, not as Liam's attorney exactly, that wasn't his specialty, but as a friend who knew the right things to say in rooms like this and the right moments to say nothing. Liam talked for about 40 minutes. He had the legal pad with him, the one he'd filled at the kitchen table, and he went through it methodically. The first visit, the second visit, the envelope, the specific phrasing about Noah. Patricia Owens wrote things down in a notebook with a pen that clicked twice every time she picked it up, which was often. She asked questions that were precise and brief, the kind of questions that weren't really questions so much as redirections. Can you describe the envelope? How long was he in the workshop? Those were his exact words. When he was done, she set her pen down and looked at him. You turned down the money, she said. Yes. Without hesitation. I thought about it for about 2 seconds, Liam said. Does that count as hesitation? She almost smiled. In my experience, 2 seconds is faster than most people. She tapped her notebook. The civil case is already in motion. What you've described is a separate matter. Attempted bribery of a witness, potentially obstruction. We'll need to corroborate what we can. We'll need your cooperation going forward. You have it. There may be a deposition, possibly testimony. Okay. She studied him for a moment. Mr. Carter, most people who come into contact with something like this, a situation of this size, with this level of financial complexity and this many years behind it, they find reasons not to get involved. Good reasons. Understandable ones. She paused. Why didn't you? He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. I have a kid, he said, and I think about what kind of example I'm setting for him. Every day, in the small things, in the choices nobody's watching. He paused. This was a choice somebody was watching, even if it was just me. Patricia Owens wrote something in her notebook. He couldn't see what. Outside the building, in the parking garage, Darnell punched him lightly on the shoulder. That last part, Darnell said, about the kid. What about it? You could have just said you're a decent person. That felt like bragging, Liam said. Darnell laughed, a real laugh, and the sound of it bounced off the concrete walls of the garage, and Liam was glad for it. Glad for the realness of it. In a week that had been heavy with things that felt too large to hold comfortably. The drive back to the workshop was quiet. He had 3 other jobs waiting: a 1940s Seaberg jukebox for a bar in the Gulch, a broken mechanical music box that belonged to a woman in Brentwood who'd inherited it from her aunt, and a portable gramophone with a cracked diaphragm that a collector in East Memphis had shipped to him in a wooden crate filled with questionable packing material. Ordinary work. Careful, detailed, patient work, the kind that didn't involve DA's offices or sealed envelopes, or men who mentioned your child as a negotiating tactic. He was glad to get back to it. He put on the radio, pulled the Seaberg onto the main workbench, and got to work. The Seaberg was a simpler case than the Wurlitzer had been. A different mechanism, a different era, less emotional weight. But it had its own complications. Someone had replaced the original amplifier with a modern solid-state unit at some point in the 80s, which was a common modification, but one that fundamentally altered the sound character, and the bar owner wanted it restored to original. That meant sourcing a period-correct tube amplifier, which Liam had already located in a warehouse in Cincinnati, but which required careful testing before installation. He liked this kind of problem. It had edges. It stayed inside its own boundaries. The Arthur Langford situation had no edges. It kept expanding. Over the following week and a half, Liam learned things through a series of conversations he hadn't entirely sought out. Victoria called with updates. The forensic accounting report had been formally submitted to the civil attorneys. A filing was imminent. Darnell called with procedural updates from the DA's contact. And then there was a call he hadn't expected from a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be from a woman named Carolyn Marsh, who introduced herself as a journalist at the Nashville Courier. How did you get this number? Liam asked. I'm a reporter, she said, as though this answered the question, which he supposed it did, more or less. I don't have anything to say to you. I'm not writing about you, she said, or not primarily. I'm writing about the Sterling family and the allegations against Arthur Langford. It's going to be a significant story. I wanted to give you the opportunity to— I appreciate that, Liam said. I still don't have anything to say. A pause. Can I ask why? Because it's not my story to tell. It's Victoria's. Talk to her. Another pause, longer this time. She's not talking to the press yet. Then wait until she is. He hung up. He mentioned the call to Victoria that evening. Carolyn Marsh, Victoria said immediately. She's been calling Diane for a week. Are you going to talk to her eventually? Eventually, when I'm ready. She paused. When the legal side is further along, I don't want to do anything that compromises the case. That's smart. It's also— She stopped, started again. It's also because I haven't figured out how to talk about my grandmother yet, in public, in a way that does her justice. He understood that. Some things needed time before they could be said out loud to strangers. It was a Friday evening, 2 weeks after the DA meeting, that Arthur Langford made his third and final appearance in Liam's life. This time Liam wasn't at the workshop. He was at the grocery. The same one. the one with the self-checkout Noah loved. Standing in the cereal aisle trying to determine whether Noah had requested the cartoon bird cereal or the one with the granola clusters, because they had discussed this on the way to school that morning, and he had been listening, but not, apparently, well enough. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. I made a mistake. I'm outside your workshop. Please come." He stood in the cereal aisle and read it twice. Then he bought both cereals, drove to the workshop, and called Patricia Owens on the way. "Don't engage with him," she said immediately. "Don't go inside with him alone. Can you stay in your vehicle until I can get someone there?" "How long?" 20 minutes. He thought about it. "I'll park across the street and wait." "Good. Don't turn your phone off." Arthur's car was indeed parked in front of the workshop, the same silver sedan parked in the same spot as last time. But Arthur wasn't inside it. He was sitting on the low concrete barrier at the edge of the parking strip, in his suit, in the heat, and he looked terrible. Liam had seen a lot of people under pressure in various forms. He'd grown up around it. He'd watched it do different things to different people. Some people got mean under pressure, some got quiet, some collapsed into themselves, and some expanded outward in ways that became dangerous. Arthur Langford, sitting on that concrete barrier in the late afternoon sun, looked like a man who had been under pressure for so long that the structure had finally started to show the strain. His tie was loose. His jacket was creased in a way that suggested he'd been sitting in his car for a while before getting out. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept properly in days. Not the tired but functioning kind, but the deeper kind, the kind that got into your eyes. He saw Liam's truck pull across the street and park. He raised one hand, a small gesture, not quite a wave. Liam stayed in the truck. He lowered the window. "Mr. Carter?" Arthur called across the street. His voice was different than it had been. The careful calibration was mostly gone. "I just want to talk." "You can talk from there," Liam said. A truck went between them on the street. Arthur waited for it to pass. "I know you've reported what happened," Arthur said. His voice was loud enough to carry across the 2 lanes, but he didn't seem to care who else heard it, which itself was information. "I know what's coming. I've spoken to my own attorneys." He paused. "I want you to know that what I said about your son, that was wrong. I wouldn't have—" He stopped. "I want you to know I'm sorry for that." Liam looked at him across the street. The thing about apologies was that they were rarely simple. They were usually about more than one thing, part genuine, part strategic, part the relief of saying out loud what you'd been carrying. He didn't know which parts were in play here, and it didn't change much either way, but he noted it. "I hear you," Liam said. "I built that family's trust over a very long time," Arthur said. "Eleanor, Mrs. Sterling, I genuinely cared about her. I want you to know that. What happened, what I did, it started as—" He stopped again, pressed his hands together. "It doesn't matter how it started. It got away from me. A long time ago, it got away from me." Liam said nothing. There wasn't much to say. He'd seen this kind of thing before, not on this scale, not with this many years behind it, but the mechanism was familiar. People did things. They told themselves stories about the things they did. The stories got more complicated over time, more load-bearing, until the stories were what was holding everything up, and the actual reality was buried somewhere underneath. "I'm not asking you to recant anything," Arthur said. "I know it's too late for that. He looked at his hands. "I needed to say it. To someone who wasn't my attorney." A police cruiser turned onto the street from the far end and slowed as it approached. Liam had texted the intersection to Patricia Owens. Arthur saw it. His shoulders dropped slightly, not in panic, more like relief. The relief of a man who had been dreading the arrival of something for so long that the actual arrival was almost easier than the waiting. He stood up from the concrete barrier, straightened his jacket by reflex, and walked toward the cruiser with his hands visible. Liam watched from across the street. He didn't feel triumph. He hadn't expected to. What he felt was something more like the feeling at the end of a difficult restoration job. Not elation, but a kind of settled tiredness. The recognition that a thing had been broken, and the breaking couldn't be undone, but maybe the damage could be accounted for, contained. addressed. He drove home. Noah had been at his friend Marcus's house, Marcus the 6-year-old, not Marcus the chaotic booking manager, and Liam picked him up on the way. Noah climbed into the truck with a construction paper robot he'd made during the playdate, colored in with purple and orange markers with the specific aesthetic confidence of a child who has not yet been informed that purple and orange are an unexpected combination. "That's great," Liam said, studying it at the red light. "His name is Roger," Noah said. "Does Roger have a job?" Noah considered this carefully. "He fixes things," he said. Liam looked at the robot for another moment. "Good job for a robot," he said. He didn't tell Noah anything about what had happened. He was 6. The world had enough time to become complicated. There was no reason to speed the process. Instead, he made quesadillas for dinner, Noah's current preferred food, simple and reliable. And they watched 20 minutes of a nature documentary about migratory birds before Liam decided Noah was approaching the outer limit of his attention span and redirected him toward bath and bed. After Noah was asleep, Liam sat on the back porch with a bottle of beer he didn't drink much of and thought about Eleanor Sterling. He did this more than he would have expected to, for a woman he'd never met. She had become a presence in his life the way certain things did. Not loudly, but persistently. The way an unresolved question stayed with you. She had lived with the knowledge of what Arthur was doing for the last years of her life, and had done what she could with the time and tools she had. She'd recorded a song, she'd written a letter, she'd hidden them in the one place she trusted, and then she'd run out of time and had to trust that someone would find them. He thought about the faith that required. Not the religious kind, just the basic human kind. The decision to believe that things could be set right by someone you'd never meet, through actions you'd never see, in a future you wouldn't be part of. That was a hard thing to sustain. He knew something about hard things to sustain. 5 years ago, the call had come at 7 in the morning. His cousin Diane, not Diane from Victoria's office, a different Diane, his cousin on his father's side, had been in a car accident. She'd been Noah's mother, though Noah was too young to have known her well. There'd been no one else. Liam had driven to the hospital, then to the social services office, then to a courthouse, and somewhere in the middle of that process, the temporary had become permanent, and the permanent had become the shape of his life. He had not planned it. He did not regret it, but it had rearranged everything. Not just his schedule or his finances, which it had rearranged significantly, but the whole orientation of his days. The question of what mattered and what didn't got very simple very fast when you were responsible for a small person. And Noah, for his part, had arrived in Liam's life with that stick-and-serious-face manner of his and had quietly become, without any particular announcement, the most important thing in it. Liam took a sip of the beer and set it down and listened to the crickets. He thought about what Patricia Owens had asked him. Why didn't you find a reason not to get involved? He didn't think the answer was as simple as what he'd said in the conference room, though that was true too. Part of it was simpler than that. Part of it was just that he'd found something that belonged to someone else, and the right thing to do with something that belonged to someone else was to give it back. Even when giving it back was complicated. Even when it cost you something. Even when a man in a good suit sat across from you and put an envelope on your workbench and said you have a son, like it was a reason to look away. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. Arthur was detained tonight. His attorney confirmed. I just heard. He typed back, I know, I was there. A long pause. Then, are you okay? He thought about it. Yeah, you? Another pause. Getting there. Can I call you tomorrow? Anytime, he typed. He put the phone in his pocket and stayed on the porch a little longer. The beer went warm, and he didn't finish it. Somewhere down the block, the same dog as always was investigating something with a measured, interested bark. The city hummed its low nighttime hum. Eventually he went inside. The next several weeks were, in their strange way, a period of waiting. The civil case moved through its early stages with the specific grinding pace of legal proceedings, filings, responses, motions, the accumulation of documented evidence that the forensic accountants were pulling together from 28 years of financial records. The criminal matter moved more carefully. Arthur had retained a defense attorney, which was his right, and the process was going to take the time it needed to take. Victoria called when she had something to report, and sometimes when she didn't, and these calls were starting to have a different quality than the early ones. less formal, more the way you talk to someone you'd been through something with. She asked about Noah once, just briefly, and Liam told her about the purple and orange robot named Roger, and she laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that didn't have anything complicated in it. Darnell came by the workshop one afternoon and helped him move the Seaberg, which had been completed and needed to go back to its owner, and afterward they sat on the tailgate of Liam's truck and ate sandwiches from the Vietnamese place next door and talked about nothing particular. Darnell had been one of Liam's closest friends for 12 years. They'd met in college, stayed close through the years in which their lives diverged significantly in external terms. Darnell into law school and a downtown firm, Liam into the trades, and then into restoration work, and had maintained the friendship through the accumulated weight of all the things they'd told each other during that time. "You seem different," Darnell said, finishing his sandwich. "Different how?" Darnell thought about it. "Less like you're just getting through the week." Liam looked down at the parking lot. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it. I'm just saying." Darnell crumpled his sandwich wrapper. "It's a good different." Ruth, the Sterling housekeeper, called him one Thursday. He hadn't expected that. She'd gotten his number from Victoria, she said, and she hoped he didn't mind. "I just wanted to thank you," Ruth said. Her voice had the particular warmth of a woman in her 60s who had spent her life caring for other people and was genuinely good at it, for finding what you found, for doing what you did with it. "I just returned some documents to my client," Liam said. "You did a lot more than that," Ruth said firmly. "Eleanor Sterling was a good woman, a genuinely good woman. She deserved better than what happened, and so does Victoria." A pause. "She doesn't have many people in her corner, truly in her corner. I've been watching that girl for 15 years, and most of the people around her are there because of what she has or what she can do for them. You're not like that." "I fixed her jukebox," Liam said. "I sent her a bill." Ruth had the tone of someone who was not going to be deflected by modesty. "You know what I mean?" He did, probably. He just wasn't sure what to do with it. "She talks about you," Ruth said, "in the way that means something." "Ruth, I'm not meddling. I'm just telling you what I see." She paused. "I've earned the right to tell people what I see." He couldn't argue with that either. After they hung up, he sat in the workshop for a while without working, which was unusual for him. He was not generally a person who sat with things. He processed by doing, by working with his hands, by the engagement of attention with a specific physical problem. Sitting still with something unresolved felt to him like a waste of time, usually. But he sat with this one. He thought about Victoria Sterling, who had inherited a company and a mansion and a legacy and a 30-year-old betrayal all at the same time, who had read her grandmother's handwriting on a record label and gone very still, who had asked him, genuinely, "Why are you being this decent about all of it?" Like decency was a thing that required explanation. He thought about what Ruth had said. "She talks about you in the way that means something." He was not, by nature, an optimistic person. He was a realist, an occupational trait as much as a personal one. Restoration work was fundamentally about understanding what was actually wrong with something, not what you wished was wrong with it or what would be easier to fix. You looked at what was there. You worked with what you had. What was there, right now, was an ongoing legal process and an unsettled situation and a woman he'd spoken to maybe 15 times total, half of them about a machine. What was also there was the fact that he'd found himself thinking about her in the small spaces of his days, not intensively, not with any particular agenda, just the way you thought about people who had impressed you. The way she'd stood in the music room and read that letter and then straightened her back. The way she'd said, "I'm not asking you to recant anything to Arthur," which was the kind of thing you only said when you meant the rest of it, when you actually intended to see it through. He wasn't going to do anything about any of that right now. The timing was wrong in about 5 different ways, and he was not a man who ignored timing. But he noted it, in the careful cataloging way he noted everything, filed it somewhere accurate. He picked up his tools and went back to work. 3 weeks later, Diane called him from Victoria's office. He'd spoken to Diane a handful of times during the restoration and found her consistently sharp and direct in a way he appreciated. "Victoria wanted me to pass along that the civil filing went public today," Diane said. It's going to be in the news. She didn't want you to find out from a headline. I appreciate that, he said. How is she? Busy, stressed, moving forward? A beat. She also asked me to ask you something, which I told her she should ask you herself, but she said she was going to be in meetings all day and didn't want to wait. Okay. She wants to know if you'd be willing to come to the house next Saturday. She's having a small dinner, just a few people. She says, Diane paused, and he could hear something in the pause that might have been amusement. She says she wants to thank you properly, and that she's a better cook than you might expect from a CEO. He was quiet for a moment. She wrote that down? He asked. The part about being a better cook? She texted it. I'm reading it verbatim. He almost smiled. Tell her yes, he said. Tell her I'll be there. After he hung up, he looked around the workshop. The mechanical music box from Brentwood was on the bench, almost done. The gramophone from East Memphis was next. Ordinary jobs, careful work, the specific satisfaction of fixing broken things and giving them back. The jukebox was gone, back in its corner in the Sterling music room, playing for the first time in 16 years. He thought about what it sounded like in that room when Eleanor Sterling's voice came through the speaker. The way the room had gone completely silent. The way silence could be full rather than empty, could mean something rather than nothing. He thought about Noah at the kitchen table, asking why ice floated, drawing robots named Roger who fix things. He thought about the shape of a life, and how it didn't always look the way you planned, and how that was not the same as it looking wrong. He turned the radio up and went back to work. The civil filing went public on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, it was in the Courier above the fold, with a headline that used the word allegedly 3 times in the first paragraph, the way headlines always did, when the evidence was strong enough that the alleged part was mostly procedural. Carolyn Marsh had written it, the same reporter who'd called Liam's cell phone weeks ago, and she'd done it carefully, which he respected even if he wasn't going to talk to her. She'd gotten the numbers right, the property descriptions right, the timeline right. She'd described Arthur Langford as a longtime family attorney and estate manager, and had quoted Victoria Sterling's attorney in a single measured paragraph that said everything that needed to be said without saying more than that. Liam read it on his phone over breakfast while Noah ate cereal. The granola clusters, which had been the correct answer, he'd eventually confirmed, and said nothing about it when Noah looked up and asked what he was reading. Work stuff, Liam said. Noah accepted this and went back to his cereal with the particular focused indifference of a 6-year-old who had assessed the situation and determined it was not relevant to his current interests. The story ran on 2 local television stations by that evening. By Thursday, it had been picked up by a regional outlet in Atlanta and a music industry trade publication that focused heavily on the Sterling Sound angle, the fact that a major independent music company had allegedly been systematically defrauded through the mismanagement of family assets tied directly to the label's founding trust. That framing gave the story legs beyond the local news cycle. Liam stayed out of it. He went to work, answered questions from Patricia Owens's office when they called, and declined 2 more requests from Carolyn Marsh, who was nothing if not persistent. The dinner was that Saturday. He almost talked himself out of it twice during the week. Not because he didn't want to go, that was the problem, in a way. He wanted to go with a straightforwardness that he'd learned to be cautious about, because wanting things straightforwardly had a way of making you sloppy about them. He thought about timing again, about the 5 different reasons it was complicated, about the fact that he was a restoration technician from East Nashville who drove a truck with a permanently illuminated check engine light, and she was a CEO whose family name was on a building downtown. He thought about that on Friday night while he was trimming Noah's hair over the bathroom sink. Noah insisted on doing this at home, rather than the barbershop for reasons he'd never fully articulated, but that seemed to involve a principled objection to strangers touching his head, and Noah was sitting on the closed toilet lid with a towel around his shoulders, very still in the way he got when he was thinking about something. "What are you thinking about?" Liam asked. "Whether fish dream," Noah said. "That's a hard one." "They have brains," Noah said. "Small ones, but brains." "That's true." "So probably they do something when they're asleep, even if it's not exactly dreaming." He paused. "Probably it's like dreaming, but simpler." Liam trimmed a section near Noah's ear carefully. "That's a pretty good answer." I know. Noah said this without arrogance, just as a fact. Are you going somewhere tomorrow? Yeah, dinner. A person I did a job for. What kind of job? A jukebox. The one I told you about. From 1962. Noah thought about this. Is she nice? Liam paused with the scissors. What makes you think it's a she? Noah shrugged, which was difficult with a towel around his shoulders, but he managed it. You said it like it was important. Liam looked at his son's reflection in the bathroom mirror. The gray-green eyes looked back, patient and observant, waiting without pressure. Yeah, Liam said. She's nice. Noah nodded, satisfied, and went back to thinking about fish dreams. He dropped Noah at Darnell's place Saturday afternoon. Darnell had a daughter Noah's age named Isa, who Noah regarded as a worthy intellectual opponent, and the two of them spent hours in elaborate arguments about subjects that defied categorization, and drove to the Sterling estate. The gate opened before he reached the intercom. She'd been watching for him, apparently. Victoria opened the front door herself, which surprised him slightly. She was in jeans and a dark green sweater, hair down, and she looked less like a CEO than she had in their previous encounters, which was either the point or just Saturday. She had a kitchen towel over one shoulder. You're on time, she said. You said 7. People always say 7 and show up at 7:15. It's a thing. She stepped back to let him in. Come in. I'm still working on the risotto. You're making risotto? Don't sound surprised. I told Diane to tell you I was a better cook than you'd expect. She delivered the message accurately. The house smelled different than it had during the restoration visits. Warmer, more lived in. Something with garlic and white wine coming from the back of the house. He followed her through the entry hall and into the kitchen, which was large and had clearly been renovated at some point in the last decade, but retained the bones of something older. Deep window ledges, a stone floor, a ceiling with exposed beams that were original to the house. Ruth was at the counter cutting bread, and she looked up when Liam came in with an expression of unconcealed satisfaction, like someone watching a plan they'd had for a while finally arrive at its logical conclusion. Mr. Carter, she said warmly. Ruth. He sat down at the kitchen island, uninvited, but it felt like the right move, the kind of kitchen where you sat down. How are you? Better every day, she said, with a specificity that suggested she meant it literally. The other dinner guests were Diane, who arrived 10 minutes later with a bottle of wine and the air of someone who had organized this gathering, at least partially, and was content to let it appear spontaneous, and a man named Theo, who turned out to be Victoria's older brother, 40, lived in Charlotte, worked in architecture, had Victoria's jaw and a more relaxed version of her directness. He shook Liam's hand with the solid grip of someone who'd been told things about him. You're the jukebox guy, Theo said. That's me. She talks about you, sir, Theo said, which was the second time Liam had heard this from someone in Victoria's orbit. He filed it in the same place he'd filed Ruth's version. The dinner was not what he'd expected, though he hadn't known entirely what to expect. It was loud in stretches, the way family dinners were when people had history together and weren't performing for anyone. Theo had opinions about Nashville's development patterns that he didn't keep to himself. Diane and Ruth had an ongoing low-level disagreement about the correct way to store vinyl records that surfaced twice during the meal. Victoria burned the first batch of garlic and had to start the risotto base over, which she did without drama and with the focused irritation of someone who had burned garlic before and found it personally offensive. Liam mostly listened, which was his natural register in new social situations. He answered questions when asked his own when the conversation moved to things he was genuinely curious about. Theo asked about restoration work with real interest, not the polite interest of someone filling silence, but the interest of someone whose own work involved the intersection of old structures and new use, who understood the value of the question, what was this supposed to be, before it became this. It's mostly patience, Liam said, when Theo asked what the hardest part was. And finding the parts, I'd imagine. That too. But the patience is the bigger thing. You can source a part. You can't shortcut understanding what you're looking at. Victoria, across the table, was listening to this with an expression he'd learned over the past months to read, attentive the way she got when something connected to something else in her head. That's what you did with the jukebox, she said. You took the time to understand it before you touched anything. That's the job. No, she said. It's how you do the job. Plenty of people would have just gone in and started replacing components. He looked at her for a moment. You'd have gotten it running, but you might have missed what was inside. The table was quiet for a beat. Ruth passed the bread. After dinner, Theo helped Ruth with the dishes. Apparently this was a standing arrangement, some domestic bargain struck years ago. And Diane excused herself early, with the tact of someone who knew when to leave. Liam and Victoria ended up on the back terrace with what was left of the wine, in chairs facing the dark garden. It was a warm night for October. The trees at the far edge of the property were starting to turn, just barely, the first suggestion of color in the black. "How are you doing?" Liam asked. "Actually?" She turned the wine glass in her hands. "Better than I was, still processing things." A pause. "The financial piece is, the accountants keep finding things. Every week there's something new, a property I didn't know existed, a payment to a company that doesn't seem to do anything. It's like, you know when you pull a thread and you expect it to come off and instead the whole hem starts to go? Yeah. It's like that." She looked at the garden. "I knew the company wasn't performing as well as it should have been. I always thought it was market conditions, competition from streaming, the usual pressures." She paused. "It wasn't just market conditions." "How bad?" "Bad enough." She said it simply, without self-pity. "We're not in trouble. The label is, the underlying business is solid, but money that should have been invested in the company over the last 15 years went somewhere else instead. Artists we might have signed, equipment we might have bought, decisions that would have looked different if the numbers were what they were supposed to be." "That's going to hurt for a while," he said. "Yeah." She looked at him sideways. "Aren't you going to tell me it'll be okay?" "It will probably be okay," he said. "But that's not the same as it not hurting for a while." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Right answer." They were quiet for a moment, in the companionable way of people who had talked through difficult things together enough times that silence didn't require filling. "I'm releasing the song," Victoria said. He looked at her. "Eleanor's song. I'm releasing it publicly." She turned her glass again. "I've been going back and forth about it. It feels like taking something that was private, but then I think about why she recorded it, what it's about, the things she was saying." She paused. "She wasn't just leaving a message for me. The way it's written, she was saying something that she thought other people needed to hear." "What's stopping you?" "Nothing anymore. I decided this week." She looked at the garden. "I'm going to put it out through the label, properly mastered, properly credited. I'm going to tell the story, the real story, about the jukebox, the letter, all of it. Not as a press play." She paused. "As, I don't know, as a tribute, as an explanation of why truth matters even when it's hard." "Carolyn Marsh is going to call you again," he said. "I know. I'm going to talk to her." She finally looked at him directly. "She's already reached out to you multiple times, hasn't she?" "3 times. You never talked to her." "It wasn't my story," he said. Same thing he'd told Carolyn Marsh, first time she'd called. Victoria looked at him with an expression he'd seen in fragments before, the one that was complicated, that had more going on in it than she was going to say. Most people, if they'd been through what you've been through in the last few months, the DA meeting, Arthur, having your son mentioned that way, most people would have found a way to make it their story. It was never mine to make. "I know," she said. "That's the thing." She set her wine glass down on the arm of the chair. The garden was very dark and very still. "I want to offer you something," she said. "Formally. Not as a thank you, though it is partly, but because it makes sense professionally. The label has a collection of historic instruments and recording equipment that hasn't been properly assessed in years. Some of it is significant. A lot of it is just sitting in a climate-controlled storage unit in Brentwood, being quietly damaged by benign neglect." She paused. "I want to hire you as a consulting restoration specialist, ongoing, to assess the collection, prioritize what needs attention, and manage the restoration work." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not looking for charity," he said. "I'm not offering it. Her voice was level. I'm offering you a contract. Fair market rate for the work, which my operations manager has already researched. Access to the collection, the kind of work that... She paused. Diane says you're talented enough that you should be working on better things than jukeboxes for bar owners. I like jukeboxes. I know, you can keep doing them. She looked at him. But some of what's in that storage unit, Liam, some of it is genuinely important. Recording equipment from the 50s and 60s. Instruments that belong to people whose music is still being listened to. It deserves someone who understands what they're looking at. He turned this over. He was not by reflex a person who said yes quickly to things that changed the shape of his life. He'd learned that deliberateness from the work itself, from the principle that you understood before you acted, that you didn't go pulling threads until you knew what you were pulling. But this felt different from most things that changed the shape of a life. Can I think about it? He said. Of course. A week. Take 2, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He nodded. They sat for a while longer on the terrace, talking about smaller things. Noah and the fish dream question, which made her laugh for real. The architecture of the back garden, which Theo had redesigned 5 years ago and which had opinions embedded in it that Liam could see now that he knew what to look for. The nature of music as a preservation problem. What made a sound worth saving? What it meant when you could hear a voice from 60 years ago as clearly as if the person were in the room. When he stood to leave just past 10, Ruth came out of the house with a container of leftover risotto that she pressed into his hands with the authority of a woman who had spent 40 years deciding these things. For the boy, she said. He's going to be at his friend's tonight. For tomorrow, then. She patted his arm once, firmly, and went back inside. Victoria walked him out. The gate at the end of the drive was visible from the front steps, framed by the 2 brick columns with their amber lights. Thank you for coming, she said. Thank you for the invite. He paused. And the risotto. The second batch was better. It was good, he said. The whole dinner was good. She looked at him in the amber light of the front steps, and the expression was back. The complicated one. But she didn't say anything she was thinking, not exactly, and neither did he, and that felt right for where things were. Not a door closing, just a door that wasn't yet the moment to open. He drove home. The apartment was quiet and slightly too warm because he'd left the heat on a setting appropriate for a 6-year-old and forgotten to adjust it before leaving. He turned it down, put the risotto in the refrigerator, and sat at the kitchen table for a while without turning on any lights. He thought about the offer. He thought about what it would mean, not just financially, though it would mean something there, but in terms of the work itself, the kind of objects he'd have access to, the kind of problems he'd spend his days on. He thought about the distinction between work that was good and work that mattered, and whether those were always the same thing, and whether the jukebox job had been both or just one, and concluded without much difficulty that it had been both. He called Darnell at 10:30, which was allowable between them because they'd been friends long enough to have negotiated the acceptable calling hours. How was the dinner? Darnell asked. Good. You going to tell me more than that? She offered me a consulting contract, Liam said, to restore the label's collection, instruments, recording equipment, ongoing work. A pause. That's a significant offer. I know. You going to take it? I'm thinking about it. For how long? I said a week. Liam. He could hear the smile in Darnell's voice. You already know. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. Yeah, he said finally. Probably. Then think about it for a week if that's what you need, Darnell said, and then tell her yes. He did think about it for a week. He was thorough about it, the way he was thorough about everything, turning it over from every angle, checking for the things you didn't see when you were looking straight at something. He talked to an accountant friend about the financial structure. He looked up the Sterling Sound catalog and spent a few evenings reading about the label's history. Its founding in the mid-50s by Eleanor Sterling herself, its decades of supporting independent artists in an industry that didn't always leave room for independence, its current position in the market. He was reading about Eleanor Sterling one night, a profile from a music journalism archive, and he came across a quote from an interview she'd given in 1978. The interviewer had asked her why she'd founded the label rather than becoming a recording artist herself. She'd clearly had the voice for it. She'd said, "I was better at recognizing the thing in other people than in myself. Some people are. It doesn't make them less useful. It makes them essential in a different way." He read it twice. He thought about restoration work, about the specific skill of recognizing what something had been and what it could be again, of seeing the value in something that other people had given up on. He thought about what Theo had said at dinner. What was this supposed to be before it became this? He thought that Eleanor Sterling would have understood that question. The following Saturday, he called Victoria. "I'll take the contract," he said. A pause. Then, "Good. I'll have Diane draw up the terms." "Okay." "Liam." "Yeah." "I'm glad," she said, simply, without elaboration. "Me too," he said. He was at the workshop when he took the call, the gramophone from East Memphis open on the bench in front of him. He set the phone down and looked at it. The brass horn, the mahogany case, the cracked diaphragm he'd been slowly and carefully repairing for 2 weeks. It was not a valuable piece in the financial sense. The collector had paid maybe $300 for it at an estate sale. But it was beautiful in the way that carefully made things were beautiful, in the way that things made before planned obsolescence were beautiful, designed to last rather than to be replaced. He picked up his tools and went back to work. 3 weeks later, Arthur Langford entered a guilty plea. Liam heard about it from Darnell, who heard about it from his contact at the DA's office, who called with the professional courtesy of keeping a cooperating witness informed. The plea covered the criminal obstruction charge, the attempted bribery, and was part of a coordinated arrangement with the civil case. The terms were still being finalized, but the broad structure was clear. Arthur would surrender his law license, return the assets that could be recovered, pay restitution on the ones that couldn't, and serve a period of supervised release rather than incarceration, which was a concession that the DA's office had made in exchange for full cooperation and documentation. 28 years of it. Liam received this information on a Tuesday afternoon and held it for a while before calling Victoria. She already knew. Her attorney had called her that morning. "How do you feel?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, like when you've been bracing for something for a long time and it finally happens, and you're relieved, but you're also still standing in the position you were in when you were bracing. Does that make sense? "Yeah," he said. "It makes sense." "Ruth cried," Victoria said. "Happy tears, I think. She kept saying Eleanor deserved to see this, which is true." A pause. "I keep thinking about that. What my grandmother would have felt seeing this actually happen, knowing the letter did what she meant it to do." "I think she knew," Liam said, "when she wrote it, that it would." "How do you figure that?" "Because she wrote it," he said. "People who don't believe in the outcome don't bother with the letter." She was quiet on the other end, and he could hear her thinking, the particular quality of silence that meant something was being turned over. "I'm releasing the song next week," she said. "Friday. I spoke with Carolyn Marsh. The story runs the same day." "Good timing." "It felt right." She paused. "I want you to hear it again, before it goes out. Would you come by the house Thursday evening? I'm going to do a small listening of it. Just a few people, the same people from dinner. I want the first time it's heard publicly to not be in someone's earbuds on a streaming service." He looked at the gramophone on his bench. The diaphragm was repaired. He'd been about to test it. "Yeah," he said, "I'll be there." He set the gramophone's needle arm in position and carefully lowered it onto the test record he used. An old 78, barely any recorded content left, just enough groove to test a mechanism. The horn filled with sound. Thin, slightly warped, a century old. But sound. Clear and present and real. He sat back and listened to it for a minute and thought about what it meant that you could make something work again after it had been silent for so long. What it cost. What it returned. Outside the shop, Nashville went about its afternoon. Traffic on the main street. The sandwich shop next door doing its lunch rush, the smell of fresh bread drifting over when the wind was right. Ordinary things, in the ordinary sequence of an ordinary Tuesday, which was most of what a life was. The ordinary sequence, the small moments, the daily work. And then sometimes, Inside the ordinary sequence, something happened that changed the orientation of everything after it. Something small at first. A phone call, a work order, a jukebox in a corner of a room. He'd learned to pay attention to those. You never knew which ordinary Tuesday was the one where something like that was already in motion. He turned the gramophone off carefully, made a note in his log, and started cleaning up his workbench for the day. He had to pick up Noah at 4. Thursday came in cold and clear, the kind of November evening that reminded Nashville it was still capable of actual winter when it felt like it. The oaks along the Sterling driveway had finally committed to their turn, amber and rust and a dark red that looked almost deliberate in the headlights when Liam pulled through the gate at 7. He'd brought Noah. This had not been the plan. The plan had been Priya from upstairs, but Priya had a midterm she'd forgotten to mention and had texted at 5:30 with an apology that was genuinely remorseful and entirely too late. Darnell and his wife were at a school thing with Isa. Gerald next door wasn't home. And Liam had stood in the kitchen at 6 o'clock looking at Noah, who was already in his jacket because he'd been told they were going somewhere and had taken this information seriously and had made a decision. He'd called Victoria. "I have a complication," he said. "What kind?" "My babysitter fell through. I either bring Noah or I skip tonight. I'm not going to put you in a position where—" "Bring him," she said immediately. "He's 6. He may not be quiet during the song." "Liam," her voice was warm and direct. "Bring him." So here they were, Noah in the back seat in his jacket with his backpack. He'd insisted on the backpack, on the grounds that you never knew what you'd need, watching the lit windows of the house come into view through the trees. "It's big," Noah said. "Yeah. Like a castle, but not a castle." "That's a pretty accurate description, actually." Noah considered the house as they pulled up. "Does a queen live here?" "No, a person named Victoria." "That's a queen name," Noah said, with the confidence of someone who had watched enough historical documentaries for a 6-year-old to have opinions. Liam parked, and they went up the front steps together, Noah's hand in his, backpack on both shoulders with the seriousness of someone carrying field equipment. Victoria opened the door. She looked at Noah with the particular expression that adults wore when they met a child they'd heard about but hadn't expected to be confronting in real life, slightly recalibrated, genuinely interested. She crouched down to his level, which he respected. "You must be Noah," she said. Noah looked at her with the frank, unguarded assessment that he applied to everything. "You're Victoria," he said. "I am." "That's a queen name." She glanced up at Liam briefly, something flickering at the corner of her mouth. "I've been told that before," she said to Noah gravely. "You want to come in? Ruth made cookies." Noah looked at Liam for confirmation. Liam nodded. Noah turned back to Victoria. "Okay," he said. Ruth was, predictably, already in love with Noah within 4 minutes. She sat him at the kitchen island with a plate of cookies and a glass of milk and asked him about school with the focused attention of a woman who had raised children and knew that the way to earn a child's trust was to ask about the things that mattered to them and actually listen to the answers. Noah told her about the fish dream question, about Roger the robot, about a kid in his class named Patrick who had opinions about dinosaurs that Noah found factually unsupportable. "He says the T-Rex was the strongest dinosaur," Noah said with controlled outrage. "And you don't think so?" Ruth said. "The T-Rex had small arms," Noah said. "Structurally, that's a problem." Ruth nodded with complete seriousness. "You make a good point." Liam left them to it and followed Diane into the music room, where Theo was already there, and 2 people he hadn't met. A woman named Sandra, who turned out to be the label's head of A&R and had been with Sterling Sound for 19 years, and an older man named Frank, who had been Eleanor Sterling's personal recording engineer for 15 years and was now in his late 70s and had driven up from Murfreesboro specifically for this. Frank was a small man with large hands and the deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades treating fragile things carefully. When Liam was introduced to him, Frank looked at him with the thorough attention of someone who wanted to understand exactly who he was before deciding what to make of him. "You're the one who found it," Frank said. "I found the envelope," Liam said. "The record was in plain sight, technically." "The record was in the first slot," Frank said. "She put it there on purpose. She wanted it to be the first thing played when the machine came back on." He paused. I was in the room when she recorded it, in 61. She did it in 2 takes. Second one was the one she kept. Liam looked at him. Do you know why she recorded it? Frank was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of a man who kept things until he decided you'd earned them. She was scared, he said finally. Not of dying, She wasn't sick then. She was 30 years old. She was scared of things getting lost. She'd watched her father build something meaningful and then watched people chip away at the edges of it after he was gone. He paused. She said to me once, the only things that survived were the ones somebody cared enough to preserve. Everything else just became furniture. The room was settling around them, people finding places to sit. The Wurlitzer stood in its corner, chrome catching the lamplight, perfectly still. Victoria came in last from the kitchen, with Noah in tow. He'd apparently decided the cookie situation was well enough established to permit exploration, and Victoria had brought him along rather than leave him loose in the house unsupervised, which showed sound judgment. Noah looked at the jukebox immediately. He walked to it and stood in front of it with his hands behind his back, the posture he used when he was examining something he'd been told not to touch. That's the one? He asked Liam. That's the one. From 1962. 1962. Noah looked at it for another moment with the focused respect of a boy who had been raised by a man who fixed things and therefore understood that old objects had weight to them. It looks good, he said. Thank you, Liam said. Did you fix the inside or the outside? Both. Noah nodded, satisfied, and went to sit on the floor near Ruth's feet when Ruth settled into a chair in the corner. He opened his backpack. It contained, Liam could now see, 3 small plastic dinosaurs, a folded piece of paper, and a granola bar, and arranged the dinosaurs in a row in front of him with quiet ceremony, apparently setting up for whatever experience was coming. Victoria stood near the jukebox. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms did when people felt something was about to happen and wanted to be ready for it. I'm going to say a few things, Victoria said, and then I want you to just listen. The room waited. My grandmother built sterling sound from nothing, from her father's record store and her own conviction that music was worth protecting. She spent 40 years believing that and acting on it, even when it cost her. She paused. In the last years of her life, she knew that someone she trusted was taking from her, from the company, from the family. And she didn't have the tools to stop it, not in the way the law required. So she did what she knew how to do. She preserved the truth in the one way she knew how. She looked at the jukebox. She put it in a song, and she hid the documentation in the machine that carried it. Frank, in the corner, was very still. I'm releasing this recording publicly on Friday, Victoria continued, and I'm establishing a foundation in her name, the Eleanor Sterling Foundation, to fund music education programs for kids who wouldn't otherwise have access, because that's what she would have done with recovered assets, and I'm doing it in her name because she earned it. She paused. I also want to thank Liam Carter, who found what she left and gave it back to the person it belonged to. Without him, the machine stays silent, and the letter stays hidden, and 28 years of theft stays buried. She looked at him directly, and the look was simple and honest and didn't make a performance out of itself. Thank you. He nodded. He didn't say anything. He'd have felt foolish saying anything. She turned to the jukebox and opened the selection panel. She placed the record, Eleanor Sterling's record, the handwritten label for the one who comes after, on the turntable. She inserted the key. She pressed the selection. In the corner of the room, Noah had stopped arranging his dinosaurs. He was watching the machine with the still attention he reserved for things he found genuinely interesting. The needle dropped, the amplifier warmed, and Eleanor Sterling's voice came through the speaker for the second time in the Sterling music room, filling the space between the floor-to-ceiling shelves and the tall windows and the people sitting in the lamplight listening. It was exactly as it had been the first time. The piano accompaniment, simple and honest. The contralto voice that knew what it was doing and didn't oversell it. The ambient quiet of the recording room underneath it all, 65 years old and still there, like a room inside a room. The song was about preservation, at its core. about the human insistence on making sure that true things didn't disappear just because time moved forward. It was about the relationship between what people left behind and what the people who came after did with it. Whether they looked, whether they listened, whether they were brave enough to act on what they found. Sandra, the A and R director, had tears running down her face that she wasn't doing anything about. Theo had his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and was looking at the floor with the concentrated expression of someone processing something large. Frank sat in his chair with his large hands open in his lap, and whatever was on his face was private, and Liam didn't look at it for long. Ruth had one hand on Noah's shoulder. Noah sat completely still, his dinosaurs forgotten in front of him, watching the jukebox with those gray-green eyes. Listening. 3 minutes and 42 seconds. The needle found the inner groove. Victoria lifted the arm. The silence after was full, the way it had been the first time. Nobody rushed to fill it. After a while, Frank cleared his throat. "Second take," he said quietly. The second take was always the one. It broke the silence gently, the way it needed to be broken. People started talking softly, the way you did after something that had moved you. Not about the thing itself, not directly, but around it. Sandra asked Frank about the recording session. Theo asked Victoria something in a low voice that Liam didn't catch. Diane poured wine for the people who wanted it. Noah stood up from the floor and walked to Liam and leaned against his side, which was his version of a hug in public spaces. The physical contact without the vulnerability of the arms. Liam put a hand on his shoulder. "Was that the lady?" Noah asked. He kept his voice low, picking up the room's register. "Eleanor Sterling, the woman who owned this house before Victoria. She's gone now? She died before you were born, long before." Noah looked at the jukebox. "But her voice is still here." "Yeah," Liam said, "it is." Noah thought about this with the seriousness he brought to genuine philosophical problems. "Like how the sound from stars is still getting here even after the star is gone," he said. Liam looked down at him. "Where did you learn that?" "The Nature Channel, the one with the British man." He didn't say anything for a moment. He just kept his hand on Noah's shoulder and looked at the jukebox and thought that his son had just said something more true and more precise than anything he would have come up with himself. Like light from a dead star, still traveling, still arriving. The evening wound down slowly, the way good evenings did, not ending so much as dispersing, people finishing conversations and collecting their things without any single moment marking the close. Frank was the first to leave. He shook Liam's hand at the door with both of his, the grip of someone saying more than the handshake, and then he said goodnight to Victoria with a gentleness that told you everything about the length and depth of his connection to her family. Sandra left next, then Theo, who punched Liam on the shoulder in the same spot Darnell always did, and told him he'd better take care of the collection, delivered with the mock sternness of a protective older brother who had decided, on insufficient evidence and gut feeling, that this was a person he trusted. Diane left last, with the satisfied air of someone whose organizational work had paid off exactly as intended. That left Liam and Noah and Ruth and Victoria in the kitchen, where Ruth had put on tea and Noah had returned to his cookies, with the renewed appetite of a child who had just witnessed something he didn't fully understand but felt was significant. "What did you think?" Victoria asked Noah, sitting down across from him at the island. Noah chewed his cookie thoughtfully. "It was sad," he said, "but not a bad sad." "What's the difference?" He thought about it. Bad sad is when something's just over. The other kind is when the thing still matters, even though it's over. He paused, checking whether this had landed. "Does that make sense?" Victoria looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "That makes a lot of sense." Noah seemed satisfied and took another cookie. Ruth started washing mugs at the sink, her back to the room, and the sounds of domestic life, water running, the clink of ceramic, made the kitchen feel ordinary again in the best possible way. Liam helped Victoria put the remaining food away, the two of them moving around the kitchen in the easy way of people who had figured out each other's spatial rhythms without discussing it. She handed him containers. He found room in the refrigerator. It was an unremarkable 10 minutes, and he was aware of it in the way you were aware of unremarkable things that felt quietly like something you wanted more of. The foundation announcement is next week, she said, closing a cabinet. Same day as the release. I'm doing a press event. Carolyn Marsh is going to be there, and a few others. She paused. I'd like you there, if you want to be. At a press event. You don't have to say anything. I'm not going to make you talk to reporters. She turned to face him. I just want the people who are actually part of this story to be in the room when it's told. It matters to me who's present. He thought about that, about what it meant to be present for something, rather than standing to the side of it. Okay? He said. Yeah? Yeah. She nodded. And there was something in the nod, some settling of a thing that had been waiting to settle, and they both felt it, and neither of them said anything about it directly because it wasn't the moment for that yet. But it also wasn't nothing, and they both knew it wasn't nothing. Noah appeared at Liam's elbow. Can we go home? I'm tired. You just had 3 cookies. I'm tired and full, Noah clarified. Ruth handed Liam the container of risotto she'd been keeping warm on the stove. She had apparently planned this, had made extra specifically for this moment, and walked them to the front door. She hugged Noah, who accepted it with the dignified patience of a boy who understood that some adults needed to hug him, and that this was not unreasonable. Come back, Ruth said to both of them. The instruction was inclusive and non-optional. Victoria stood on the front steps while they went down to the truck. Noah climbed in and buckled himself. He'd mastered this at 5, on the grounds that self-sufficiency was important, and Liam stood at the driver's door for a moment. Thank you for tonight, he said. Thank you for bringing him, she said. He's something, your kid. Yeah, Liam said. He is. She stood on the steps with her arms crossed against the cold and watched him pull away, and he saw her in the rearview mirror until the drive curved and the trees came between them. She's nice, Noah said from the back seat. Yeah. Like you said. Like I said. Noah was quiet for a mile or two, looking out the window at the dark neighborhoods passing. Then, are we going to go back? Liam thought about Ruth's instruction, about the consulting contract that started Monday, about the storage unit in Brentwood full of instruments that had been waiting for someone to pay attention to them, about a woman standing on front steps in the cold watching taillights. Yeah, he said, we're going to go back. Noah received this with a small nod and went back to the window. Outside, the city moved past in its nighttime configuration, lit windows, empty streets, the distant glow of downtown against the low clouds, all the ordinary, unremarkable architecture of a life in motion. The press event was held on a Tuesday morning at the Sterling Sound offices downtown, in a conference room with tall windows overlooking the street. Victoria had borrowed a room with actual acoustics. She'd had someone come in the day before to test the sound setup, which Diane had reported to Liam with the dry affection of someone who respected thoroughness, and was also gently amused by the extremity of it. There were maybe 20 journalists there, plus the people from Victoria's team, plus Liam standing near the back wall in the only sport jacket he owned, dark gray, bought for a different occasion 3 years ago, still fit, which he took as a minor victory. Carolyn Marsh was in the front row. She was younger than Liam had expected from her phone voice, early 30s, focused, with a reporter's practiced stillness and a notebook balanced on her knee, even though she had a recorder running on the chair beside her. Victoria spoke without notes for about 15 minutes. She told the story cleanly and without self-pity. Eleanor's recording, the jukebox, the envelope, the documentation that had been sitting in the dark for 16 years waiting for someone to look. She talked about Arthur Langford with the specific, non-dramatic clarity of someone who had processed their anger into something more useful than performance. She talked about the foundation and what it would do. Music programs in 7 Title I schools to start, with a goal of 20 in 3 years, instrument lending libraries, after-school recording studios. She talked about what it meant that a woman who had been silenced in one way had found another way to speak. She was not perfect at it. She got slightly off track in the middle and had to find her way back. Her voice did a thing on the word grandmother in the 3rd paragraph, just briefly, that she covered by pausing and taking a drink of water. She was a CEO giving a speech, not an orator, and the speech had the slight roughness of something that mattered too much to be entirely polished. It was better for that. The roughness was the proof of it. Then she played the recording. In a room full of journalists, people professionally trained to maintain observational distance, to take notes rather than feel, the recording did what it always did. It made people stop. It made the room go somewhere else for 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Carolyn Marsh had stopped writing. When it ended, the questions came. Practical ones first, then deeper ones. Financial numbers, the timeline of the investigation, the foundation's funding structure. Then, what does it mean to you personally that this was preserved in this particular way? And what do you hope people take from the song? Victoria answered all of them. Somewhere in the middle of the Q&A, she looked toward the back of the room where Liam was standing. A brief glance, just checking. He gave a small nod. She turned back to the journalist who'd asked her something and answered it. After the formal session, in the milling around period when journalists reviewed their notes and publicists managed follow-ups, Carolyn Marsh made her way to Liam with the directness of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Ms. Marsh, I've been trying to reach you for 3 months." "I know." She studied him. She had the journalist's habit of letting silence run a little longer than was comfortable to see what people filled it with. He didn't fill it with anything. "I'm not going to ask you to go on record about anything you don't want to," she said finally. "But I want you to know that the story I wrote, the way I wrote it, I tried to get it right, not just the facts, the character of it." "I read it," he said. "You did." She seemed to appreciate that he'd said it plainly. "The thing I couldn't figure out," she said, "was you, the angle that doesn't fit the usual shape of these stories." "What shape is that?" "The whistleblower who has something to gain, the informant who's protecting themselves, the activist with a cause." She paused. "You didn't have any of that. You just found something and gave it back and refused to be bought." "That's a pretty short story," he said. "Or a pretty long one," she said, "depending on how you tell it." He looked at her for a moment. She was good at her job. He could see that. The kind of good that came from actually caring about what things meant rather than just what they were. "Write what helps people understand why it matters," he said, "not what makes it a better story. Those are different things sometimes." She wrote something in her notebook. "Can I quote that?" "Sure." "Do you have anything else?" He thought about it honestly. About Eleanor Sterling and the faith required to leave something in the dark for someone you'd never meet. About Arthur Langford and 28 years of a mechanism quietly failing while everyone trusted the machine. About Noah asking if the sound from dead stars was still getting here, and the particular accuracy of that image. About the things that survived because somebody cared enough not to let them go. "Just that it matters who fixes things," he said. "Not just that they get fixed. Who does it, and why, and what they do with what they find." He paused. "That's always been true. It's probably always going to be true." And Carolyn Marsh wrote it down. The piece ran the following Sunday. It was long, nearly 4,000 words, and it told the story in the careful, full way that the story deserved. It covered the legal case, the foundation, Eleanor Sterling's legacy, and what it meant for independent music in Nashville. And it had a section near the end about Liam that he read sitting at his kitchen table on Sunday morning while Noah ate the granola cluster cereal, and which he found accurate in the factual sense and slightly uncomfortable in the personal sense, which probably meant it was honest. The line Carolyn Marsh had chosen to end his section with was the one about who fixes things. He read it and looked at his coffee and thought that was as close as he was going to get to being understood by a stranger, which was closer than most people got. Noah looked up from his cereal. "Is that about you?" Liam set the paper down. "Part of it." "Can I read it?" "When you're older." "That's what you say about everything interesting," Noah said, with resigned accuracy. "That's because you're 6. Noah accepted this with the philosophical tolerance of someone who understood the constraint, even if he found it inconvenient. He went back to his cereal. Outside the kitchen window, the November morning was gray and still, the maple in the neighbor's yard finally bare, its leaves having finished the project they'd started in October. Liam's first day at the Sterling Sound Storage Unit was a Monday, 3 weeks after the press event, The unit was in a climate-controlled facility in Brentwood, two connected rooms about the size of a generous garage, and what it contained was Liam stood in the doorway the first time and felt the specific feeling he got in front of a large restoration project. A feeling that was part anticipation and part overwhelm and part the deep satisfaction of a person who has found, in front of them, exactly the thing they were built to do. There were guitar cases stacked against one wall, 12, 14, more, some of them labeled in marker on strips of masking tape, a Hammond organ in pieces, 3 reel-to-reel tape machines in various states, a wall of shelved recording equipment, mostly from the 60s and 70s, microphones in cases, condenser and ribbon, some of them older than Liam's parents, a piano in the corner with a covered keyboard and a bench that had a broken leg, held up by a brick. And the records. Entire shelves of them. Not commercial releases, but session recordings, acetate discs, labeled in the careful handwriting of engineers and producers from decades ago. Music that had never been released. Music that might not have been heard since the day it was recorded. Victoria was there for the first morning. She walked him through the inventory she'd had Diane pull together. Incomplete, she warned him, because nobody had done a proper assessment in years, and answered his questions when she had answers and said honestly when she didn't. "This is going to take time," he said, standing in the middle of the room, turning slowly. "I know. Not weeks, months, probably the better part of a year before I know what we actually have." "I know," she said again. "That's why I wanted someone who understood the value of taking the time." He looked at the Hammond organ in pieces. Someone had partially disassembled it and then apparently lost interest, leaving the components wrapped loosely in moving blankets. He was already thinking about what order to approach the room in, what needed immediate stabilization, what could wait, how to document without losing anything in the documentation process. "I'm going to need better lighting in here," he said. "Done. And shelving. The record storage is inadequate. I'll have Diane handle it. And someone to help with inventory, not restoration, just cataloging. A second pair of hands for a few weeks." "I know someone from Belmont who does archival work," Victoria said. "Graduate student. She'd probably be interested." He nodded, still looking around the room. "Okay," he said. "Okay? Let's get to work." She smiled. A real one. Not the professional one he'd seen in the early months, but the one that came out in the evenings on the back terrace and in the kitchen when Ruth said something sharp and funny. He'd learned to tell the difference. He started that morning with the tape machines because they were the most temperature sensitive and had been stored in a way that made him nervous. He pulled the first one onto the work table he'd set up and opened his case. Victoria watched for a while, asking occasional questions, and he answered them the way he always did when people asked about the work. Plainly, without condescension, with the assumption that anyone willing to ask was worth answering. She asked good questions, which he'd expected by now. At some point, she stopped asking questions and just watched, and the room settled into the quiet rhythm of someone working carefully on something that mattered. He found, on the third tape machine, a reel still loaded, still in the machine, decades after someone had set it there and left it. The tape looked intact. He had no way of knowing what was on it without cleaning the machine and running it, which would take days. He labeled it, photographed it, added it to his log. Unknown recording. Reel to reel, approximate date, unknown. Contents. TBD, condition appears stable, priority assessment needed. He set it carefully on the designated shelf and went back to the machine. Outside the storage facility, Nashville did its ordinary thing. Traffic on Franklin Road, the lunch rush at the restaurants a block over, the city in the specific mode of a Tuesday in November, all its business and noise and forward motion. Inside, it was quiet and careful and slow, the way good work always was. He thought about Eleanor Sterling, who had understood that the only things that survived were the ones somebody cared enough to preserve. He thought about a jukebox in a corner of a room, silent for 16 years, and what it had been carrying. He thought about the faith required to leave something in the dark and trust that the right person would come. He thought that sometimes the right person was just the person who showed up. He was good at showing up. It was maybe the thing he was best at, in the end. Not brilliance, not genius, Just the willingness to come back to a thing every day and give it your full attention until it told you what it needed. To stay with something broken long enough to understand what it was before it broke. His phone buzzed on the corner of the work table. A text from Noah, via Priya's phone, Chasha. She'd started letting him send one supervised message a day, a privilege he used with great deliberateness. Dad, do fish dream. He stared at it for a moment. He typed back, probably something like dreaming, but simpler. 3 dots. Then, okay, see you at 4. He set the phone down and went back to the tape machine. The reel on the shelf caught the light as he moved. Just a flash, the silver edge of the tape against the fluorescent. There and then not there. A small, ordinary thing. He didn't know what was on it. He didn't know if it would turn out to be something significant or something that meant nothing to anyone outside the moment it was made. He didn't know how many more things were in this room waiting to be found or what they would tell him when he got there. What he knew was that he'd be back tomorrow. And the day after that. That he'd open the next case and the next machine with the same care and the same patience, the same commitment to understanding before acting. That he'd document what he found and report it honestly and let it go where it needed to go. That was the work. That had always been the work. Not just the machines, but everything that the machines had led him to. Every sealed envelope, every difficult conversation, every moment where the easier thing was to leave what was broken where it lay and pretend the not looking was the same as the not finding. He'd learned a long time ago that it wasn't. He picked up his tools. He got back to it.